welcome to Literary Prospects, where we talk to authors and literary professionals about books, publishing, and the writing life. I'm Kelley Vick. I'm the host of the program, and in just a moment, it will be my pleasure to introduce today's guest. But first, a reminder that if you like what you hear, please do take a moment to subscribe. It helps us out, and you can make sure you never miss an episode. Also, we've opened a Literary Prospects shop, so if you're looking for bookish shirts, totes, and gifts, please check that out at literaryprospects.etsy.com. And to grab books featured on the podcast and check out more curated book lists, you can visit the Literary Prospects bookstore on bookshop.org. We'll leave all those links below in the show notes. And now, let's introduce today's guest. A.D. Rhine is the pseudonym of Ashlee Cowles and Danielle Stinson. The authors are united by their military brat upbringing, childhood friendship spanning 2 decades, and love of classical literature. Ashlee holds graduate degrees in medieval history from the University of St. Andrews and theological studies from Duke University. Danielle holds a Master of Arts in Law and Diplomacy from Tufts University. Their adult debut, Horses of Fire and Daughters of Bronze, an epic duology of the Trojan War, is the story they've always dreamt of writing together. Daughters of Bronze is out now. Ashlee Cowles and Danielle Stinson, known together as A.D. Rhine, thank you so much for joining today. I am so excited to talk with you about your sophomore novel, Daughters of Bronze. Author Claire M. Andrews says Daughters of Bronze is an epic feat. The lyrical writing of A.D. Rhine sets this book apart from so many Greek myth reimaginings, bringing to life a tale as old as time in ways not yet seen, a stellar accomplishment. Library Journal says the narrative skillfully combines politics, strong character development, and the incorporation of other Near Eastern cultures to develop Troy into a realistic setting. Booklist says this sweeping epic is recommended for anyone interested in ancient history. Author Lauren J.A. Baer says, with a powerful poetic style reminiscent of the past and a modern perspective, Daughters of Bronze brings the women of war-torn Troy to vibrant, luminous life. Each page sings with the strength and sorrow of 4 voices, 4 stories, coming together in one shared chorus. Their song, "Nothing is impossible when women find each other and fight back." And one more. Author M.J. Pankey says, A.D. Rhine masterfully reweaves the fate of Troy with an emotional depth and heroism that rivals Homer's original epic. An astonishing reimagining of myth and history that shines light on the courageous figures long overshadowed by male perspectives. So with that, welcome again. And what can you tell us about Daughters of Bronze?
Thank you so much for having us. We are delighted to be here. Daughters of Bronze is our epic historical take on the Trojan War, in which we focus on 4 voices: Andromache, Hector's wife, who in our version is an Amazon general, and Rhea, a refugee horse whisperer turned most unlikely spy ever. Helen of Troy, who is sort of set up as Andromache's rival, and Cassandra, Hector's cursed and very misunderstood sister. And these women, who come from different backgrounds and have different stories, must come together in an attempt to rewrite the ending of Troy. And so we honored the original, but we wanted to show how the same story could be told and be viewed very differently depending on who was telling it. And we hoped in that way to bring something that the readers were both expecting and several things that the readers weren't expecting.
What was the spark that got you both interested in writing about the Trojans? And what made you want to tell this story particularly from the female perspective?
Yeah, well, I think we've known each other since we were 15 years old. We met on a U.S. military base in Germany, on the soccer field, and we really bonded over kind of our love of like classic fantasy and epic historical fiction and just war stories. And we both had, as we as we stayed friends over the course of 25 years, we both kind of had our own experiences with the original version of this myth, or at least the most commonly known version, Homer's Iliad.
Mhm.
So Danielle's dad actually recited the lines and when read the Iliad to her when she was in utero. And
Wow.
she heard it first. And I taught high school for a while, where we actually spent the whole first semester of ninth grade classical English reading just the Iliad. And so we did a real deep dive into the story and spent a lot of time with it. So we both kind of had these individual experiences with it throughout our childhood and young adulthood. And we always talked about we both published first individually and
Mhm.
in the young adult space. And we always talked about writing a story together one day. And this just seemed like the story, given kind of our shared background growing up in, in a culture that has a lot of similarities with what the people of Troy maybe were experiencing. And just our love of this story, it just made sense that this was going to be the story we were going to retell. And we were really interested in telling it from the perspective of women, since we grew up witnessing so many amazing women who, were holding down the home front during times of war and watching their loved ones go off to fight. And so we felt like we could hopefully make that feel very relevant and relatable to modern readers by kind of infusing some of our own life experience into this very ancient story.
We've talked about the four female perspectives that we have here, Andromache, Helen, Rhea, Cassandra, the warrior, the healer, the spy, the seer. How did these particular characters come to you? Did you build them around real historical figures? How did that work?
We did. We, the in the original Iliad,
Mhm.
they're present. Even Rhea, who some people think we completely made up,
Mhm.
is based on a character in the Iliad who gets no lines and or gets no she never speaks, but she's referenced to. So she's
Mhm.
a Trojan servant, and so we wanted to really point out the fact that, here's a person who could have perhaps played a pivotal role in the war, but we never actually hear from her. She
Mhm.
never actually gets any lines. But one of the ways we wanted to approach this story differently, maybe perhaps from some other Trojan War retellings, is to take these characters who really do stand out in the Iliad in their own right, even if the story isn't as focused on them. They all seem to have, very unique personalities, and we get a sense of who they are in the original myth. We wanted to take that and infuse it with actual Bronze Age history
Mhm.
and research some of the women, especially in ancient Anatolia, since most of the time we're getting the Greek perspective of this war. We wanted to look at some of these lesser known figures in ancient Anatolia. So, for example, we have and even further afield. So we have Queen Puduhepa, who inspired our take on Andromache. She was a Hittite queen who had her own royal seal, which basically meant she could approve documents in her own right. She didn't need her husband's approval to approve documents. Her seal's actually on, we believe, the first peace treaty that we have. And she rearranged the entire Hittite pantheon. She was pen pals with Ramses II in Egypt. So she was this extremely powerful figure. And before we started doing research for this story, we had never heard of her. So we thought, this idea that Andromache is not Greek. She's from this region of the world. Perhaps, that the portrayal that Homer gives of her as a Greek writing this story would not be as accurate as the actual historical woman who might have lived in this region of the world at that time. So that's one example. Also, the Amazon warriors, a lot of people think they're just a myth. They're just part of Greek mythology, but archaeologists have discovered the burials of women warriors of the Eurasian steppe. So that was a kind of another element we wanted to bring into the story, the fact that it wasn't just a mythology. That there may have been women warriors in this part of the world.
I want to talk about your backgrounds for a second, which are quite impressive. Combined, you two hold graduate degrees in medieval history, theological studies with an emphasis on the ethics of war and peace, and law and diplomacy. So you have a deep scholarly knowledge of the realities of conflict. So, how did your own scholarship play into the writing of Daughters of Bronze? And then what further research did you do?
So that is thank you for asking that question, because it really lets us nerd out on the things that really drew us, some of the things that drew us to this story in the first place. So what struck us first and foremost was that when you start to look into the late Bronze Age, the similarities between the complicated, interconnected world at that time and our own they cannot be overstated. I mean, there are so many ways. We had this idea of what the past was, and that, people just stayed in place, and, that none of that is true. The systems of the past, economic, trade, all these things were so just intricate. And so this world really, really could teach us some things. We could learn some lessons from it. So that was the first thing. And also, climate change, mass migrations of people. There were so many things that were happening in this world, which people almost could feel was on the brink of collapse, but nobody really knew when or how it was going to happen. And so that fascinated us, because the idea of why did all these societies that, like these massive civilizations, were almost entirely wiped off the map. There are only a few survivors at the end of this. So Troy really is, the Iliad is almost like the story of a falling city, basically is the example, the metaphor for what happened in the world at this time, and which is one of the reasons we personally believe that this is the story that was passed down, because it represents a shift that was so just drastic that it had to be preserved. And so our backgrounds, particularly like international relations, my political systems and theory, like why conflict is such an endemic nature, why we go to war. These are all things that I've always been interested in, not only because of how we grew up and how conflict did dictate a lot of the trajectories of our own lives from being children to adulthood, but also that's what we both pursued in different ways. So we both were really chasing this, asking the same questions and approaching them from different sort of disciplines, trying to get at the same answers. And in the story of Troy, we felt like we had a playground and a way to really look at these things and to pull them apart and then put them back together in a way that included both our academic backgrounds and the knowledge and the things that we had accumulated, but also making it human and personal, because at the end of the day, the weapons may change, the languages may change, the countries may change, borders are redrawn, but people remain the same. And that is what allows us to connect to something that is so old and make it feel so, and it can remain feeling so relevant and present in our current times.
Where do you think the line should be, or where do you want your line to be? Sort of what are you thinking as you're writing between the mythology and the history, right? The fantasy and the reality, if you will.
That is such a good question. I know Ashley's going to chime in at the, with her own take, but I feel like fantasy, people often think, because of gods and goddesses, they think that mythology is fantasy. But it isn't, because fantasy is the creation of a person. It's a complete construction. I mean, it's based in, whatever influences them, but it is, completely constructed by the author. But mythology is the way people understand their place in the world around them. It's how they are connecting to their distant past. So for much of, human history, mythology and history were the same thing, because that's how people understood their own past. So I think the line between history and mythology is blurry at best. And so for us, it's when we're thinking about mythology, we're thinking about the things that make us human and the things that come up again and again, which is what, as we said, makes it relevant. But now we have this idea that history is infallible, right? Like now that we have history, since Herodotus and Thucydides, we have history now. And so we are in possession of the facts. But that, in my opinion, and this might just be me, could not be further from the truth, because, history really is just a story. And depending on who's telling it, they're arranging certain facts in certain ways. and they are giving you a perspective, but that will never be the whole thing because it's too complicated for us to really arrive at the truth. So what we need, and we're thinking about history, we always have to think about it from like, what are the other perspectives? So more perspectives are always better. And that's what we wanted to do with this. We wanted to give the perspective of the vanquished. We wanted to give the perspective of the people that did not survive to tell their story and how might it have looked different. So yeah, mythology and history, blurrier line than I think a lot of people may realize or even want, it's easier because to think that way, because otherwise you never have to stop trying to learn and look at things from different ways. Because there's no one right answer.
Yeah, and I would just add that I think, as far as where we drew the line in our retelling, is if we did make changes to we both love the original myth and we tried to stay very true to the spirit of it. But if we did make changes, it was usually in the service of, oh, there's new archaeological discoveries that have revealed something new about this culture or this time period. And so if we did make changes, it was usually to try to make the story more rooted in history rather than less. For example, like Helen of Troy has been blamed for for generations for starting the Trojan War, and we kind of thought, well, what's more realistic, what's more plausible, that the geopolitics of the age is why this war started, or one woman who committed adultery was the cause. So we wanted to kind of root it in history more and look at the Bronze Age world and what was happening at the time, and kind of go with the more historically plausible setup as opposed to maybe the one that is traditional in the mythology.
You've said that you wanted this to feel like a Bronze Age Game of Thrones. Is that right? What do you mean
Yeah.
by that exactly?
Well, I think, again, given our background and how we met and our life experiences, I think what's always stood out to us about this story is how it does just timelessly speak to the experience of those who have lived in a warrior culture. So there's a famous goodbye scene between Prince Hector of Troy and his wife Andromache, and it's one of the most famous scenes in the Iliad. And I think anyone who has ever said goodbye to a loved one who is serving in the military can, like, it hits very hard, and it's
Mm.
hard to believe that it was written thousands of years ago because it feels so true to that experience. And so, we wanted this story to feel like an epic war story, that even though we were telling it from the perspective of the women of Troy, that you weren't just trapped in the walls of Troy, weaving alongside Helen, kind of waiting for the war to be resolved. We wanted, all of these women to have agency, to be doing things behind the scenes that you would never know out on the battlefield, but that were impacting the war. And so that's where we kind of incorporated our love for epic fantasy, so stories like Game of Thrones or even Lord of the Rings. So like a big scope, emphasis on immersive world building and multiple point of view characters, lots of secondary characters, spy
Battle
plots.
scenes.
Yeah, spy plots, love, forbidden love stories, political intrigue, factions, kind of all those elements. Because we felt like, that's what the story would have actually been, as opposed to just kind of focusing on who is fighting who on the battlefield.
Yeah. You just mentioned world building, which is beautifully done in this novel. It's very immersive. Um, Difficult to do if you're not trying to write as a team. But I'm wondering how that works with you guys writing together. What does that look like? How does that work when you're first sort of visualizing this whole world? Are you just like sitting together writing things out, and then where does it go from there? Are you each person takes a perspective, or what? How does it work?
So there's how we thought it was going to work, and then there's how it actually ended up working. So we've been along with each other since the beginning of our publishing journey. So to just start this off by saying, we are intimately familiar with each other's writing, with each other's voices. And when we sat down to write the story, it wasn't just that we were going to tell a story and this is the plot and these are the characters, but the heart of what we were trying to say was the same, which I think is why most people who don't know are surprised that we are two people, because we wanted, when we wrote this, to write from one voice, the story to have a very distinct heart, and that was we had to be aligned on that. And so that happened sort of just magically so that was a hard part, but that happened without any effort because of, I think, our relationship with each other. As far as the mechanics and how we did everything else, we had been talking about this while driving. I mean, for years and years, we'd have kids screaming in the background and we're on speakerphone in our vans, like talking about all the things that we wanted to do and, but when we really started writing the story was during the pandemic, when we were locked behind the walls of our our own homes and really feeling somehow a connection to these women. So it really made it feel even more immediate. I mean, there's a pandemic, there's a plague in this as well. I mean, there were so many things that kind of made that moment where everything was sort of felt like it was on the edge of falling apart, feel like the moment that we wanted to do it. And also just being isolated like we were, being able to write, using Google Docs, kicking something back and forth to each other became such a way to stay connected while everything else was so, disconnected. And so we thought we each took two of the characters and we each created two of the voices. And we thought we were just going to go back and forth after, planning out what was, having a loose plan, and we knew what was going to happen, but didn't end up happening that way. We sort of, it got so much messier, and at one point the characters just became who they were, and it was like they were telling us what to do. And so yeah, it was complicated and messy, and there were times when we were on the same page at the same time, and it was the most beautifully chaotic and amazing creative experience, I'll speak for myself, that I have ever had. And it really feels like the sum was greater than its parts. Because you're writing a story about sisterhood and friendship, and when you're writing it from that place, it just felt like that magic thing happened where, sort of just came out.
Yeah. Was it like that for you, Ashlee?
Yes. Yeah, I think it was. I mean, we started writing when I was pregnant with my second child, and then when he was born. And I look back and I'm like, how did that even happen? Like, I don't remember.
Wow.
It's all like the blur of the newborn phase mixed with like this crazy creative process during COVID. So yeah, I'm glad Danielle can remember like specifics because it all just feels like this wonderful creative blur. But yeah, it was a very unique experience, and hopefully we can repeat the magic.
Are you working on another one now?
We do have a couple projects in the works, yes. So we definitely want to continue writing together. So
How, we know you've been friends for 25 years. You've talked about your close friendship. When did you discover that you should be writing partners?
yeah,
I think I've been writing forever, and I feel like, I don't know, I think it just happened where I was like, I don't even remember how the seed was born, but I think we always just knew we were going to do it, and we've been writing, for a long time, even just for fun, and so I feel like it was just an organic thing, and because we are, each other's first readers, and because of that, it just felt natural, even though it's funny too, because when you're writing, most writers are control freaks, and you want to be, but it is very much like a trust fall. But I feel like we both, when we set out, we didn't fully know what to expect. We were hoping it was going to work, but we weren't positive that it would. And so yeah, I don't know, Ashlee, do you remember a
yeah.
specific
Well,
moment?
we haven't actually lived in the same state for many years. So I think part of it was honest that like it was natural that we were, always each other's first critique partner and reading each other's work and collaborating that way. But I think, honestly, like until Google Docs became like this popular tool that people were using, we probably wouldn't have even thought of it as a
Mhm.
possibility. So that's one thing we always tell writers when we teach on this workshops on this topic is it's probably going to become more popular because we actually have the tools that make it possible. Whereas before, the collaboration would have just been too difficult, that most people probably wouldn't have even thought to try it.
Yeah. You teach workshops on this. What would you say is your best piece of advice for writers? I'll ask you later your best piece of advice in general for aspiring authors, but right now I'm interested in what's the best piece of advice for friends who are writers who think that they want to collaborate on a project, like where to begin.
Yeah, I think probably where I'd start is you really have to trust the person and be willing to have like a lot of just open, honest communication with each other. I
Mm,
think people who maybe are afraid to like draw boundaries or say how they really feel about something, it could that I feel like that is when like tension could build kind of beneath the
mhm,
surface and
mhm.
where it could become a more difficult experience. But if you feel like you really know the person, you trust them, and that you can actually talk to them about just about anything, I think that that's definitely a good place to start from.
Yeah, and I would say know what you're make sure that before you start, you know exactly what you're trying to create. Because I think that you have to be writing to the same end goal, whether that's genre, even if it's mixing lots of different things, you need to know what your story is and not just the plot, but also how it's going to feel, uh, so that that can be consistent and to make sure that those vibes, for lack of a better word, are meshing because if it's hard, it's so much more than just plot structure and it really has to feel cohesive even if you're writing two different distinct, one person going back and forth. You need to feel like you're writing in the same story, same world.
Yeah.
So that would be what I would say.
You were both writing on your own, you said, and you were each other's first readers. How did each of you get started writing? Were you both writing already when you met when you were 15? Have you each always been writers? What did that look like for each one of you?
I've always been a writer. I mean, I wrote some very dark poetry in elementary school for my first novel, and I don't know, it was like third grade, which was
Wow.
Don't Wear Polka Dots. It was a total rip off of Ghosts Don't Eat Potato Chips. I don't know. But anyways, I actually still, my cousin, who's also an author, still has some of these early manuscripts that she is probably holding as hostage. You know, some of it is just some of it, but I've always written, and I went to school, but I went to when I pursued my undergrad and graduate degrees, I always thought you had to have like a real job first before you went out and became a writer
Mhm.
or try to. And I was like, I haven't been writing stories the entire time. And so I finally like thought to myself, like, why am I doing this? And so then I committed to really pursuing it and putting my work out there. And so and my first novel came out in 2019. Um, and the process of getting there was really just less about, putting things out, more deciding that it's something that you really want to go for and you're doing it anyway. And you might as well just, you know,
Yeah.
give it a go.
Yeah. Ashley, what
Yeah,
about you?
I've always been a reader. I don't think I thought of myself as a writer until much later. I always loved writing in school. And I do remember like in fifth grade writing like it was some horrible fan fiction of like The Dark Crystal, probably the movie.
I would
And
have read that.
yeah,
Yeah. Me
but
too.
I remember writing it and being like, wow, this is a lot harder than I thought it was going to be. So I like put that aside, never going to do that again. And but always loved books, but I didn't it wasn't until after college, and I was a history major and loved reading historical fiction and thought like, well, if I don't teach history, maybe this is something else I can do with this background knowledge. And so that was kind of my entry point, was like just a love of historical fiction.
And then what was the road to publication like for each of you individually and then together? We've got several roads
Yeah.
here
Yeah.
converging.
Yeah.
Lots of twists
So
and turns.
yeah. The thing about this for any writers who are listening, it's different for every single person. But it is good to know all the different ways that it can happen. So my early journey was really fast. Like wrote, I'd been writing all along and saving these things, but I'd been doing it for me just because I loved it so much. And that's how it's my favorite thing to do is read and write. And then finally I was like, you know what? I wrote a story after my first son was born. I was like, I feel like I would love to share, like I want to see if I can do something with this one. And then I really researched who would be right for me. And I had a very small list, like, and I think that my second query got me my agent but it's because I was doing it it was very academic. I put in a lot of work up front, I think, to make sure that it was ready to go. But just because that part was fast, like that book did not sell because it was dystopian right at the worst time. And I was writing it because that's my background, but it was at the worst. So then I take to for my, it was a longer journey to get from having an agent to publication because I had to go back to the drawing board and like several times, and because the market is part of it. It's like you have to write what you love, and sometimes the timing will be right and sometimes it won't, and it doesn't mean that those stories don't have value, but it just means that it's not the right time. And so I had to wait a little bit longer before my debut published in 2019 with Macmillan, and it was a science fiction um, and it was like a contemporary science fiction. Yeah, and then I realized after writing young adult, I was like, I think I've been writing adult all along, and I knew that I wanted to write adult. And then this sort of happened with the two of us. So I've been working on my own things individually and with Ashlee, but if she really doing this really helped forge the kind of pathway into writing adult, which is where I feel like I was headed all along.
Yeah.
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 Yes, same here. And I would just add that, it was a winding journey of up and downs and rejection. Like I think a lot of people do think it just kind of happens instantaneously, but I worked with several different agents. The agent that we both currently share, actually, she's amazing.
Mhm.
But it took a little bit of time to find the right fit. And I think I've probably published every way that you can. So, a big five publisher, a smaller independent press, published one novel independently myself. So, I feel like I've kind of experienced all the different publishing routes, and have learned a lot of lessons along the way because of that. But I think, yeah, I feel like we're in a good place now with kind of knowing, okay, we want to write for adults. We want to write historically rooted stories about that feature untold stories about women. And so it's nice to kind of have found your zone.
Yeah.
Mhm.
What do you know now that you wish you'd known before you published your first book?
You know, I feel like I almost wish that I knew less. I
Wow.
feel like to be brutally honest, I feel like
Mhm.
when you come into this and you're writing just from such a place of love and desire, not knowing is one of like you should know, I mean, how to query all those things, but writing from that pure place is a gift. And I feel like with too much knowledge, sometimes we have too many things in our heads about what we should be doing, what works, what doesn't work. You're thinking 5 years ahead, 2 years ahead when books come out. And I feel like the thing that I wish that it's almost more like I've learned a lot. I definitely have learned a lot, but I think the most important things I knew at the beginning, and now I'm trying to remember them. And
Mhm.
that's like you write because you love to write. You tell a story because you want other people to read it, and the main goal is to make anybody else feel the way you felt when you were reading the books that you loved. Um, and that's the only thing you can really control. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Ashlee?
I think I would just say just that, it is for most writers, it is a long game. It's about endurance and the ability to kind of stick with it. And like everybody most people are an overnight 10-year success. Like it's the people that you see that seem like they just are, suddenly successful. It's they've probably put in, most of the time they've put in a lot of years and have had successes and failures, and it really is different for every author.
What do your daily writing routines look like now? Are you, because you're working on individual projects and your projects together, right? So
Yeah.
like that's probably a lot of, what does it look like?
I mean, it should
Yeah.
be.
Yes.
Yeah. I feel like we work, so that's the funny thing about, we have we're aligned on all the things when we sit down that are important, but we could not work more differently. The way that we write is opposite. And that's the thing that we learned through our process of how to better give each other space to do what we do well, because our approach is totally different. So for me, it's very feast or famine. When I'm writing, it is like, it's coming out and it's coming out at one time. And I'm probably writing all the time. And thinking about it and waking up in the middle of the night. It's a very like you're pouring it all out sort of phase that usually doesn't take a long time, but it's been like festering up there. So it's like it's a process of like exercising it. And so that means there are also periods when I'm not writing, when I'm reading a lot, where I'm experiencing things. So for me, it's a very like gathering life experience, gathering sensory things, and then pouring it out is how I work. So right now I am just turning from, and editing is totally different. Editing is a completely different part of the brain. So I'm not even counting that, but right now I'm transitioning from the having collected all the things and I'm full on pour, ready to turn on the spigot.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I'm different in that I'm probably never not writing. So for my day job, I'm a copywriter, so I work in marketing, and so I'm constantly doing writing of some kind, but it's often a very different type of writing from my creative writing. So it is more of a kind of daily, consistent thing that I'm doing, and it is. I think it feels a little bit more like, okay, it's time to work. Which project am I working on? Let me sit down, put my butt in the chair, and get some words down, and kind of just deciding what the project is, what the goal is, and it's something that I have to be much more consistent about. Otherwise, I will get completely out of that state of flow and like lose my vision for the story, lose the characters. And so it's never, I maybe only can devote like an hour a day to it. But if
Mm-hmm.
I can do a little bit every morning when I first wake up, eventually something starts to take shape.
And when you're sitting down, are you writing to an outline? Are you like more, or is that sort of a pantsing it situation where you're seeing what comes out and then fixing it up later?
We have
Yeah.
discovered that writing together, it is, having at least a basic outline makes it a whole lot easier
Yeah.
and
Yes.
a lot less revision. Um, so, I think Danielle's a little bit more of a pantser. I'm a little bit more of a plotter, but neither of us are like on like the complete
Extreme.
extremes of those.
Uh-huh.
So that does help. We can kind of work in the middle there. But I think writing together, I think with Horses of Fire and Daughters of Bronze, we have kind of a basic plot because we have the Iliad.
Right.
But so we felt, I think, more comfortable not plotting it out or outlining it as much. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and then the result of that is we did have to do a bit more division, partly because we divided one big story into two stories, into two books.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mhm.
and we had to give each book, its own climax, its own fulfilling ending. So there was some work there, but I think going forward, we will try to outline a little bit more while also kind of giving each other room to play and to kind of discover things as we go.
Yeah.
And Danielle, you mentioned you're collecting in your mind and then you're turning the faucet on and
Hmm.
doing the writing. But then you said that the editing and revision process is
Hmm.
totally different again. So I'm just curious about
Hmm.
what that part of it is like for you.
So for me, the magic has to be there when I'm writing it. And even if it's like 12 lines of complete dribble and one that is gold, the
Mm-hmm.
gold is going to be there for me in the first draft. I can make things better and I can find things and I can, find things, when in the process of revision. But the core, when I write, the core of what it's going to be is usually there because I'm like an emotional writer. So I feel it, I'm in it, I'm doing it. And so whatever is going to be true is going to be there from the beginning. And then editing for me is very much either like pruning and then fleshing things out and adjusting. You can weave things into, but it's like the heart is going to be there. So it feels different it feels more, actually I love writing, but I also love editing because it's amazing how much more brightly things can shine when you're cutting out what doesn't need to be there, etc. So but they feel like different, like I'm using different parts of my brain.
Yeah.
And I think that for Ashlee,
Yeah.
like
Well,
more so
I'm
like
kind of the exact opposite. So
Really?
I have a
Mhm.
really hard time with the first draft because I think that's like where all my insecurities come up as a writer, where I'm like, wow, I forgot how to do this, or I don't think I'll ever be able to write another novel again. And it's just like I have to tell myself like just keep going, get the first draft done, and then I'm gonna go back and I'm just, figuring out who the characters are, figuring out what the basic plot is, and then I'm going to go back and layer things in and add depth and kind of find what it is about that basic structure, that there then I'll find the magic and then I'll be able to layer that in as I go. So that was something we definitely learned co-writing is we're the opposite in that way.
Yeah, and it's helped us develop our process because now if you write to an outline and now we have very detailed outlines that still allow me ways to throw the wrenches and everything because that's what we love to send each other like there's a surprise in there and it's so fun. It just makes it so much more fun. But you know, and we've tried to make it so that we each have the time that we need with the parts that we need to
Mhm.
bring it to the place where we're like ready for it to be, and then we go deep dive
Yeah.
everywhere. But that we know how much time it's going to take and what that person needs to feel like they are, you know, ready to like roll up our sleeves and let's get in there and make this amazing.
It sounds like you really complement each other and your styles really work very well together to make this beautiful finish.
We used to dream of living, spending our old age together with a bunch of cats in the practical magic house. And
Yeah.
that didn't work out. But now we do this together. But yes, we have been we've been complimenting each other for a long time.
Yeah. I promised earlier that I was going to ask you, and now I'm going to. Um, Best piece of advice in general for aspiring authors?
Hmm.
I would just say write what you love, write what moves you. And there's nobody that's going to tell a story the way that you tell it. And
Mm,
so you already have that superpower. So just, kind of worry less about what's going on and just write from that place of conviction and desire, because if you're feeling it when you're writing, then the reader's gonna feel it and the rest of it you can't really control. So do something that you're gonna be glad that you wrote no matter what.
it's great.
Yeah. And related to that, it's a similar piece of advice, but I think don't be afraid to put yourself in your story. In the
Mm,
sense of, I think when we first start out, we're imitating other people a lot of the time, and that's very natural. That's kind of how you start writing, is you think of the books you love and you say, "Can I do that?" And sometimes there's fear of putting aspects of yourself, things that you personally love, things that you personally value into a story because maybe you have this sense that you should be like detached from it or creating characters, creating a world that is nothing like your own.
mm,
Um, and I think, just, Daughters of Bronze, for example, we put a lot of ourselves and the things we really care about and our own life experiences into this story. And I think in ways we hadn't in anything we'd written previously. And hopefully that's what, hopefully the reader can tell. Hopefully that's what gives it like an emotional resonance that, um, crosses time because it makes, the readers who are experiencing it feel like they're connecting with real women.
yeah. The reader can tell. The
Oh, good.
Good,
reader can
thank you.
tell. Traditional last question that we have on this podcast. When Daughters of Bronze is made into a movie or series, what do you think the theme song should be?
Oh my gosh,
Goodness, this is hard.
that is such a good question. Well, I will tell you,
We have
so
like
we have a
we have a
couple.
playlist of songs. It's going to be hard to narrow it down to
There's a
one.
lot of Dermot Kennedy on there. We're
Yes.
not gonna lie. There's some Josh Groban, some soaring notes in the tenor.
From Celine Dion. It's all very
It's
dramatic.
big power ballads. Mary J. Blige, like power ballad. We are in power
Oh,
ballad.
Mary J. Blige could be interesting.
Yeah, we're kind of doing it. We're gonna do a video, and one of her songs is the music for that. That's why it's in my head. So
Oh,
yeah,
love it.
Hourglass. That would be one of mine. I'd say Hourglass, or I would say One Life, Dermot Kennedy. That was a good one.
That's what I was gonna say. So yes, those two.
You do, what is
Guys
the
have the
Ashes song
consent.
Celine Dion does? That one.
That one too, yeah.
Only no Deadpool. Think less Deadpool, more like actual ashes. Actual.
But yes, the power ballad to sum it up.
The power ballad. Ashlee Cowles, Danielle, Stinson, AD, Rhine, thank you so much for being here. I have really loved getting the chance to talk with you both today.
Thank you, Kelley. We've really enjoyed it too.
This has been so fun. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on Literary Prospects. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe and leave us a review. We'll see you next time.